We're now going to talk about something called selectors. Selectors are essentially filters inside the Retrospect program. We see these by going to Backup, and then there's a button that says Selecting. Under Selecting, we have a list of default selectors. We're going to go ahead and look at each of these selectors, and we'll also talk about how to create selectors of your own. So we'll cancel that, and we're also going to cancel this, and we're going to go to Configure, and then go to Selectors, so that we can view the selector editing window. The first one we have is all files. If we double click on the selector, it basically says that we're going to include everything and exclude nothing. So that really does mean all files. All files except cache files. Retrospect lists for us a series of known cache files that are going to be excluded from the backup when you choose this particular option. You can add your own cache files to the end of this selector. Applications backs up anything that is not a document and is not part of the actual operating system. Documents backs up files that you have created. Essentially, a documents will exclude the Windows operating system folder, and it excludes applications so that it gets everything else on your machine. Documents and settings backs up specifically documents and your settings. So as you can see here, it includes preferences, it includes documents and settings folder on Windows. Movies looks for specifically files that have known movie file types. Music does the same sort of thing. It looks for and backs up files of known file types for music. No files is typically used for testing, and it really does exactly that. It does no files. We also have an option for Office documents, which does Microsoft Office documents as well as PDF documents. Operating system and applications will back up your operating system plus applications. The OS folder will back up the operating system specific folders. Pictures will back up picture files of known types, and you can always add additional picture files to this list. And then we have one called Retrospect files, which backs up files that are created by Retrospect. Let's go ahead and create our own custom selector. We're going to click on New, and we're going to call this MP3 and Games. What we're going to do is we're going to tell Retrospect to exclude all MP3s and all games. So what we do is we click on the plus under the exclude section, and we type in .mp3 next to the name condition. And we're going to uncheck folder, and we're going to say file name does, and we're going to say end with .mp3 and click OK. Then if we click on the bottom plus next to the faded word or, we'll get an or condition. And then we can add the word games. And we can say folder name does match games. And we're going to include the enclosed folders. Now Retrospect will automatically include everything but exclude items that end in MP3 or items that have games as the folder name. To find out whether this selector is going to do what we would expect, we have an option over here called Check Selector. So we select that option, we choose the drive that we would normally back up using that selector, and click OK. Retrospect will then scan the drive, and then display for us items that are selected based on the selector. In this case, items that are not chosen are items that are being excluded during a backup using this particular selector. If we scroll through the list, we're going to see that there are specific items that have been unchecked. In this case, we see that the MP3s are not selected. So, how do I use this particular selector in a script? Well, now that we've created the selector, we can close it and save our changes. Now, when we go to Backup, and we click on the Selecting button, the item we created, called MP3 and Games, automatically appears there. Now, when we perform our backup, it's going to exclude the MP3 and Games, because that's what we told the selector to do. We're going to cancel that, and let's take a look at the selector again. We can also go ahead and we can change this a little bit, and we can click on the down or on the bottom box here to get a hand, and we can drag upward. And by dragging upward, it'll turn it from an OR condition to an AND condition. We can also make other changes. We can take an item, click on it, and drag it up to the include section. Now Retrospect will look for items that contain MP3 in the name. We'll go ahead and delete the games condition and run the check selector again. This time, Retrospect will only highlight MP3 files. And as we can see in the list, Retrospect at this time has only selected the MP3 files. So we've changed the selector from an exclude to an include just by dragging it from the the bottom section to the top section. We can add additional criteria to this selector by clicking on the plus and then going in and entering in something else like DLL. So now we're going to look for files that end in DLL. And then Retrospect will get all MP3s and all DLLs. Let's go ahead and close our selector and say don't save. And let's look at one of the other selectors for movies. And if we were to go to the very bottom of the movie selector, we can go ahead and we can add our own movie to it. So if we know that we have a movie type that we want to include, we can click on the bottom plus here and enter in the file information for that movie. Selectors use a lot of Boolean logic, and so some users do have a harder time understanding how to make a selector do what they really want it to do. The best advice we can give for creating selectors is to keep it simple. There are 1,000 different ways of achieving the exact same results. When you're looking at a selector, you can use double negatives that say does and does not. You can tell things to end with or contain, or you can do things based on a pattern, and that can get really complicated. So what you want to do is try and keep it as simple as possible, and then always use the check selector option so that you can identify whether the selector does what you want it to do. One thing that we've seen in the field is users may go in and modify the all file selector and then enter in something inappropriate. So if they were to enter in something like this and then run the backup, there's a strong possibility that Retrospect could put itself in a situation where the backup reports that it's completed successfully, but no files have been copied. And in a situation like that, the user might have a false sense of security thinking that the backups are getting all files, because Retrospect has reported that it was successful, and it was successful based on the selector. Unfortunately, you want to make sure your selectors are doing the appropriate thing so that you don't find yourself in a bad situation. The best advice, though, is to always do all files. There's really, in today's modern drives, we typically have enough space to copy all the data. And if you exclude something from the backup, the one item you exclude is going to turn out to be the one item you really need in the event of a disaster. In any event, let's go ahead and take a look at selectors in a little bit more detail at the different criteria that are available, and then you can try selectors on your own. We have attributes. We can look for items in a browser based on whether they have a diamond or a check mark. We can also look for read-only items or hidden items. We can look for data on a backup by searching on a browser for items with a specific client name. We can also search by date, and this can be very useful. We can use this as a search tool. We can also use selectors for a backup tool. So we go over here and we can tell Retrospect to look for files whose modified date is before a fixed date plus a couple of days or a specific number of days. This can be a very powerful option if you want to back up items, as an example, that were modified in the last 2 weeks. We can also look for files that were backed up from specific file systems, items that came from specific login names. We can have selectors within selectors. We can also search for things based on size. So you can specify that you want to look for all files that are larger than a couple of gigabytes or a couple of megabytes. And then you could back up all of these large files. You could use this in an archive operation to look for on your network for items that are larger than, let's say, 2 gigabytes, and then you can have those items automatically archived off of the network. We can look for things that come with a specific volume name. Then we have some Windows-specific attributes. So we can look for things that have a system flag, encrypted flag, offline. We can do things based on the Windows access date, the Windows drive letter, a specific Windows path. And in this example, we show you how the path should be formatted when you type it inside the field. Special folders. These look for folders that Windows has identified as being like the active recycle bin or the active desktop folder or documents folder. We have Macintosh specific attributes like file busy, alias, has bundle, or custom icon. We can also look for things based on Retrospect's type and creator code. Macintosh label colors are also a useful tool when doing backups to exclude or include things. Path. We have examples of the type of path information you would enter if you wanted to look for information based on the path on a Macintosh. Permissions. We can specify macOS 10 permissions. Special folders. And the Macintosh has a long list of special folders that you can include or exclude, but just by adding them to a selector. We also have Unix attributes, such as path and permissions. And then for mailboxes, we also have specific information for mailbox senders. Selectors can be a very useful tool if you use them appropriately. We also have the ability to export your selector. So if you have a selector that you found to be very useful in your environment, you can export that selector as a .rxx file. That selector can then be imported into any other copy of Retrospect so that you can use the same criteria in multiple locations.